Hi everyone. This little mini lecture over here is going to deal with the concept of two-level negotiations. You've been introduced to that through the article that you're reading in Unit 2, the article by Mark Boyer. It's a little bit heavy and dense, so I wanted to follow up with this with some more explanation. So if you got everything from the article, this should be just a quick review. Otherwise, you may find some interesting pointers here. So the topic is this idea of two-level negotiations. And here we can go back to 1988 and the very well-known political scientist Robert Putnam, who came up with with this idea of two-level interactions. He was talking about domestic politics, but this is also true for international negotiations. And if we are staying in this context of international interactions, then when we are talking about the two levels, level 1 will always be level 1. This is when the international actors actually sit down to negotiate. If we're thinking about the Iran nuclear deal, this is when the P5+1 on their representatives and the representatives of Iran meet or exchange information and actually negotiate with each other. That's level 1. Level 2 is what happens in the background. What is the internal debate between all of the groups that have stakes in this matter? What do Congress members think? What do different representatives of the different states, if we are in the United States, or different representatives of political parties, what do they think? What are the opinions of important lobbyists and donors, etc. So everything that happens in the background is level 2. Now, level 2 is very important. The argument is that level 2 is very important to level 1 because without the domestic agreement, international negotiators really have their hands tied behind their back because they can only agree to things that then their country would ratify and implement. Otherwise, we're just exchanging words and nothing really matters. Now, this is true in all nation states, regardless of the type of government, but it's especially true in democracies, of course, when we have the democratic process, when we have free and fair elections, where who is the head of government or can change, etc. But even if you look at a much more closed political system like the one that we have in China, still the negotiators can only go as far as the country, the military, the party will go along with them. Now, here is another concept. So we introduced this concept of the two-level game or two-level negotiations. And now we need to think about another concept, which is the win set. What are the range of options that both sides can, or if it's more than two sides, that the parties to negotiations can agree on? For any case, for any dispute, we can continue with the Iran nuclear negotiation here. There is a range of options that will be acceptable for both Iran on one side and the P5+1 on the other side. Of course, the P5+1 wants one thing, Iran wants another, but hopefully in the middle there is some range of options that they can both agree on. If that range is very small, if that win set is very small, or if it doesn't exist, we can talk, but we most likely won't get to any agreement. Now, when we tie together this idea of a wind set and two-level negotiations, what we get is this statement, that basically level 2 constrains the options or what is possible for level 1 negotiators, because level 2 controls the size and the range of that wind set. Now, what we really need in this case is not just a wind set between the international actors, but also an overlapping wind set that would satisfy level 2 as well as level 1. And we can look at this graphic here to try and better understand it. So on the top over here, we have the wind set or the range of the wind set for level 1 negotiators. So between the international negotiators, we can imagine this range of acceptable international outcomes, right? But here on the bottom, we have the wind set range for level 2 in the domestic arena of one, at least of one or both of or more. Again, if there are more than two parties involved, what is the wind set? What is the domestic wind set? What are the accepted domestic outcomes for those actors, for those players involved? Now, an agreement will be found if there is an overlap between those. So somewhere in this range. Because even though level 1 negotiators might go into this area over here, they cannot really accept any solution that will fall here because it will not be accepted for their domestic constituents. And without an agreement from the domestic constituents, without the capability to ratify and implement the agreement, it's a null agreement or dead upon arrival, pretty much. So the only way we can solve this conflict is if we can map out an overlapping wind set between those two levels. Now, say that you are a negotiator and you want to try and obviously you want to work with a big of a range as possible, and you want to try and be able to expand this wind set or the range of that wind set. There are several things that you can do. You can manipulate your own wind set. You can use political power, you can use propaganda, you can use the media, or just good old campaigning to sell whatever options you want in your own country. And you can also do the same thing by using public diplomacy, but trying to influence the public of the other side, right? Again, if we look at the Iran case, we see a lot of times leaders from the Western world talk to the Iranian people and try to convince the people, not necessarily the government officials, but the people to accept whatever the West, whatever the P5+1 are suggesting here. And the idea behind that is that if we manipulate enough people and they can put pressure on their own government, then by that we expanded the possible level 2 wind set for the other side, and therefore gave ourselves a little bit more freedom of maneuver here. You can also use transnational network, NGOs that work across borders to try and grab more or to expand the range of that wind set. And of course, you can use pressure from strong interest groups within your country, or again in another country, in order to kind of push the point that we can do that. Now, as we said before, in international negotiations, level 2 acts as a constraint, but it can also be what pushes action. If you look at a situation in Somalia at the beginning of the 1990s, the reason the United States got involved in that conflict in the first place was the media exposure. This was the initial days of cable news networks, and the pictures that came from there of the starving children, of the people, of the refugees that had no resources. And that's how level 2, the domestic constituents, pushed level 1 to try and do something. So level 2 is a constraint, but it can also be a stimuli for action. And you can, as an international negotiator, you can use level 2 tactically. You can say in a negotiation, listen, my dear counterpart, I understand your position. I actually would like to support it, but I really can't, because that's not going to be approved in my legislature. Or that if I come back with this kind of agreement, my president is gonna be impeached for treason, right? So you can use that in order to explain why you can't be as flexible as you would like to be in the international negotiation setting. Or you can do that, or you can explain if you change your mind. So this is using level 2 is another good way to kind of climb down from high trees. So if you started a negotiation with a position that you will never give up on X, but then you, as the negotiation go on, you want to give in a little bit on that point, what you can do is you can come up and explain, saying, at the beginning, we couldn't accept any agreement within that range because we didn't have the domestic support. Now the domestic situation changed. We have the domestic support. Therefore, we can accept that same offer that you started with at the beginning. And by using that explanation, you can save face. Now, another important thing is that when you are negotiating, in order to understand what is possible here, you need to try and understand what are the level 2 constraints of the other side. Because if you're demanding something that the other side just cannot accept because of level 2 constraints, you will not get to any agreement. But if you know well the level 2 constraints and pressures on your counterpart in the negotiations, you can really come up with creative ideas and offers that are much more possible. Now, generally speaking, in any situation that we negotiate on, the higher the intensity, the more actors are involved, the more groups that are interested, there's more public attention, and therefore there is less autonomy for decision makers and negotiators in level 1. So if we're talking about a high level, a high politics, high intensity issue that a lot of people and groups care about, level 2, the impact of level 2 would be much larger. And this is not just, the intensity doesn't just depend on the situation itself. Obviously, if we're talking about a border dispute, you can see why it's important, but it's also how it is framed. What is the perception behind it? Because in the case of Arglou and Pendant that you played, there were many different ways to increase the intensity of the case just by building on the perception. Some of you pushed on that. The identity of the people in Alta. We're not going to give up on our people. So it's different, right? If you just talk about a border dispute as a piece of territory, or if you're talking about the identity and cultural connections of people who live there. So this is a good example of how one case can be framed as more with higher intensity than it is. It also depends that out of the agreement, how many winners and losers are there, and are they all paying the same cost and getting the same benefits, or do we really have some groups that are going to win more than others? We also know that change, if you are pushing for a change rather than maintaining the status quo, you are likely to get a lot more attention and some objection, and therefore the intensity goes higher, level 2 constraints are higher, and level 1 autonomy is lower. And of course, in situation of a crisis, we tend to see this rally around the flag effect, which actually gives level 1 negotiators a little bit more leeway because there is arguably a lot more unity behind them. And emotions play a role as well. So the articles go into all of those in much more detail, and we will discuss them later on in the semester as well. Another thing that this article presents, another interesting concept, is this idea that every issue area can be either domestic or international, but there are also those intermestic issue areas, those things that are penetrating. And in a globalized world with the high level communication and exposure that we have now, a lot more issues become intermestic than they would have been in the past. And when we talk about foreign policy, we are talking about issue areas that cover the international and also the intermestic. Now, in the United States especially, but in other countries too, if the issue is pure international, then the president or the executive have more power over that issue. If it's an intermestic problem, then in the United States it's the president, or in other countries the executive normally loses some power, and therefore the two-level game becomes more and more important. And again, you can spin and frame, and the media is important here, because think again about the Iran nuclear negotiations. You could argue that this is more or less a pure international issue area, right? But you can spin it to become an intermestic area, because it has to do with some groups, some constituents that are interested in solving that situation. It has to do with national security and budgets to different states and different branches of the military, and in all those ways you could spin that and make it an intermestic issue, and therefore other actors become important, and we are playing a two-level game. And so then the article goes on to present those four models where, with a high intensity and an international issue, we are talking about a chief of government model, where level 1 is more important. On the other hand, if we are talking about a high intensity and an intermestic issue, we are talking about a political decision-making model where level 2 will be highly important. And then we can also have the international and low intensity issue area, where level 1 negotiators will have most of the will have almost complete autonomy over the decision making in the negotiation. Or the sub-government, where we are talking about an intermestic and low intensity, we will have some level 2 play here, but not as much as over here. And to be honest, every topic, every issue, every problem that we're taking could have some movements along those 4 quadrants, especially in those 3. Right? And so here are, the points. Level 2 is less important in the chief of government model, even though it is a high intensity. And the win set in level 2 is large. This is, you can think about a crisis, right? An attack on the United States. Everybody are uniting behind the chief of government to support whatever they want to do. It's not that the domestic environment is not important. It's just that it is in support of the chief of government. In the political model, as I say, this is divisive. We are dealing with divisive issues that are emotions are involved, livelihood of people. You can think of the beginning of the 1990s NAFTA negotiations here. And then level 2 is very important, and the win set, the overlap win set, is going to many times be very, very small. In the sub-government model, the 3rd quadrant, low intensity and intermestic, there's going to be some constraints on the negotiations, some level 2 constraints, but not as much as in the political model. And then finally, in the administrative model, low intensity, international, almost no involvement from the public or no public attention, and therefore level 2, if used in such negotiations, if mentioned at all, would only be used as a tool rather than an actual constraint on the negotiators. So I hope you found this helpful in understanding the article, and that you read the article or go back to read it after you watch this as well. And I asked you in discussion number 2 to kind of try and apply a little bit of what we learned about the 2-level negotiations.